Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, where we go beyond the silence, mixed signals, and emotional distance to understand what avoidants may really be feeling beneath the surface. If you want deeper insights into avoidant attachment, relationships, and the hidden meaning behind their behavior, consider becoming a member of Avoidant Decoded and join us as we decode the psychology behind love, fear, and connection. What if the person who seems least capable of showing love is actually showing it in ways you were never taught to recognize? An avoidant may not chase, confess, or express everything they feel, but sometimes the smallest things they do require the greatest courage. They stay when everything inside them says to run, they reach out when vulnerability feels dangerous, and they slowly let you see the person behind the armor. Today, you are going to discover the quiet signs that can reveal what an avoidant may be feeling when words are not enough. You may think you already know what love is supposed to look like. You imagine grand gestures, dramatic confessions, someone fighting through the rain just to prove they care. Movies have taught us to recognize love through loud, obvious actions. But when you are dealing with someone who is emotionally guarded or avoidant, love can look completely different. Sometimes the most meaningful thing they do is so quiet that you almost miss it. And that is the part I want you to understand. The rarest thing an avoidant may do for someone they genuinely care about might not look romantic at all. You could see it happen and think, that was nothing. But underneath that ordinary moment, something much bigger may be happening. You may be watching a person move against years of emotional conditioning simply because you matter to them. So if you have ever been confused by someone who seems distant one moment and deeply present the next, pay attention. Some of the moments you dismissed in the past may carry a completely different meaning once you understand what is happening beneath the surface. An avoidant does not simply wake up one morning and decide to become emotionally unavailable. Often, these patterns develop because closeness once felt unsafe. Perhaps their feelings were ignored when they were young. Maybe they learned that asking for comfort led to disappointment, rejection, criticism, or silence. Over time, they may have learned an important survival lesson. Depending on yourself feels safer than depending on another person. So they became independent. They learned to handle things alone. They became good at pushing feelings aside, creating distance when intimacy became uncomfortable, and convincing themselves that they did not need anyone too much. But that does not mean they do not feel deeply. In many cases, the emotions are still there. The difference is that they have learned to keep those emotions contained. While another person might express affection naturally, an avoidant may experience emotional openness as something risky. Trust is not automatic for them. It has to be earned. That is why small acts of openness can carry enormous meaning. One of the clearest examples is simple: they stay. When a conversation becomes emotionally intense, when you start discussing feelings, fears, needs, or the future, an avoidant may instinctively want to create distance. They might become quiet, change the subject, leave the room, or emotionally withdraw. But imagine that this time they do not. Maybe they look uncomfortable. Maybe they need a moment to process what they are feeling. Maybe you can tell they are struggling internally. Yet instead of escaping, they remain beside you. Do not automatically dismiss that. For someone who has learned that distance creates safety, remaining present during emotional discomfort can represent a major step forward. They are choosing connection, even though part of them is telling them to retreat. That does not mean every avoidant who stays is secretly in love. But when staying becomes part of a consistent pattern of emotional effort, it can be meaningful. Another subtle sign is when they remember details you barely remember telling them. Maybe you casually mentioned a difficult experience from your past. Maybe you told them about a food you love, a place you want to visit, a song that means something to you, or a small detail about your life that you never expected them to remember. Then weeks later, they bring it up. They might ask how something went. They might send you something connected to that conversation. They may see something while going about their day and immediately think of you. That matters because attention creates connection. When someone is emotionally guarded, allowing another person to occupy their thoughts can feel surprisingly vulnerable. Remembering the little things means you are not simply someone they interact with in the moment. You have started becoming part of their internal world. That is a form of intimacy. Then there is something even deeper. They tell you something they normally keep hidden. It may not come with tears or a dramatic confession. They might say it casually, almost as though they are trying to make the moment seem smaller than it actually is. They might tell you about something painful from childhood, a fear they rarely admit, a failure they still carry, something embarrassing they have never shared, or perhaps a private dream they are afraid other people would judge. And then there is often a quiet question underneath their words. Is it safe for me to show you this? That is the part most people miss. For an emotionally guarded person, vulnerability can feel less like casual conversation and more like taking a personal risk. They are allowing you to see something they normally protect from everyone else. If you respond with patience rather than judgment, that moment can become incredibly important. When someone reveals something vulnerable and discovers that they are still accepted afterward, their nervous system can begin learning a new lesson. Closeness does not always lead to pain, and sometimes the biggest sign is not that they never become uncomfortable, it is that they begin telling you when they are uncomfortable. Instead of disappearing without explanation, they might say, "I need some time." Instead of shutting you out completely, they may admit that the conversation is difficult for them. Instead of pretending everything is fine, they may actually communicate what is happening inside. That may look like a problem on the surface, but compared with complete withdrawal, it can represent real progress, because emotional growth does not always look like someone suddenly becoming affectionate, expressive, and completely open. Sometimes it looks like a person who once disappeared whenever intimacy became uncomfortable, learning to remain present, communicate their limits, remember what matters to you, and slowly allow you to see behind the walls they built for protection. That is why you should not measure love only by dramatic gestures. Look at consistency, look at effort, look at whether they are gradually becoming more emotionally available. Look at whether they communicate instead of disappearing. Remember what matters to you and choose connection even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Those quiet changes can say far more than a grand declaration ever could. And if you are building a relationship with someone who has an avoidant pattern, remember this. Understanding their behavior does not mean excusing unhealthy behavior. Love still requires respect, communication, consistency, and mutual effort. But when you recognize genuine movement toward connection, you may finally understand that sometimes the smallest action is the one that required the greatest courage. One of the most overlooked signs is when an avoidant starts communicating their discomfort instead of simply disappearing. They might tell you, "I'm feeling overwhelmed right now," or "I need a little time, but please don't think this means I don't care." Maybe they simply admit, "This is difficult for me." That may sound simple, but it can represent a major change in behavior. Someone who normally responds to emotional pressure by becoming silent or creating distance is now putting their internal experience into words. They are admitting that they have feelings, that the relationship affects them, and that they are not completely untouched by what is happening. Explaining themselves requires vulnerability. It means lowering the emotional armor for a moment and allowing another person to see what is happening underneath. So when they choose communication instead of disappearing, pay attention. They are making an effort to handle the relationship differently from the way their instincts may have taught them. They are not necessarily comfortable, but they are trying to remain connected while uncomfortable. That effort can be far more meaningful than someone simply saying the right words when everything is easy. Another powerful sign is that they show up when you genuinely need them, even when doing so is inconvenient. Emotional needs can be difficult for an avoidant person to navigate. When someone is hurting, scared, or overwhelmed, the instinct may be to fix the problem quickly, change the subject, or create distance until the emotional storm has passed. Sitting beside another person's pain requires presence, and emotional presence can feel intensely vulnerable. So think about the moments when you truly needed them. Maybe you called while crying, and instead of ending the conversation, they stayed with you. Maybe you were sick, and they came to check on you even though they had other things planned. Maybe you were going through one of the hardest days of your life, and they did not try to escape the discomfort. They simply stayed beside you. Do not automatically treat that as an ordinary gesture. For someone who normally protects themselves from emotional intensity, choosing to remain present with another person's pain can require them to push through their own discomfort. They are temporarily putting your needs ahead of their instinct to retreat, and sometimes they may not even realize how significant that choice is. Then there is another sign that can be extremely revealing. They begin initiating. They message you first. They suggest seeing you. They make plans without waiting for you to ask. They say, "Let's go here," or "We should do this together," simply because they want your company. For many people, initiating contact feels completely natural. You miss someone, so you text them. You want to see them, so you make a plan. But for someone who is strongly avoidant, reaching out can expose something they would rather keep hidden. It reveals that they want connection. It shows that you have become important enough for them to take emotional risks. They may normally tell themselves that they are simply giving you space, but sometimes beneath that explanation is a fear of reaching out and discovering that they are unwanted, rejected, or becoming too emotionally dependent. That is why voluntary initiation can be meaningful. They are allowing desire to become stronger than fear. They are essentially saying through their behavior, "I want this connection enough to take the risk." Now consider what happens after conflict, because this is where relationships often reveal the deepest patterns. An avoidant person may withdraw when an argument becomes emotionally intense. They may need time alone to calm down and process what happened. Sometimes that space can turn into prolonged silence, leaving the other person wondering whether the relationship has simply ended. But imagine that after taking that space, they return. Maybe they say, "I've been thinking about what happened." Maybe they admit they handled something badly. Maybe they simply ask, "Can we talk about this?" The important part is not that they never withdrew. The important part is that they came back to repair the connection. Returning to a difficult conversation means facing the same emotions they originally wanted to escape. It requires them to risk vulnerability again. It also requires them to acknowledge that the relationship is valuable enough to repair. That is emotional progress. Healthy connection is not about never having conflict. It is about developing the ability to return, communicate, take responsibility, and rebuild after the conflict. Another quiet sign appears when they begin making plans that include you in the future. It does not have to be something dramatic like talking about marriage or planning your entire life together. Maybe they casually say, "We should visit that place sometime." Maybe they mention something happening a few months from now and naturally assume you will be there. Maybe they start talking about something they want to experience with you later. That may sound completely ordinary, but it can reveal something deeper. The present is easier to manage because it does not require much emotional certainty. The future requires imagination, hope, and investment. It means allowing yourself to believe that another person may still be part of your life later. For someone who has learned to protect themselves from disappointment, that kind of expectation can feel risky. So when they naturally begin placing you into their future, even through small comments, they may be allowing themselves to imagine more time with you. They are no longer thinking only about what exists today. They are making emotional room for what could exist tomorrow. And then there is the moment when they stand up for you. It may not be dramatic. Maybe someone makes an unfair comment about you and they correct them. Maybe they defend your character when you are not present. Maybe they make it clear to someone in their circle that you are important to them. The key is that they are willing to reveal that you matter. People who are emotionally guarded often protect the things they care about very carefully. Showing someone what matters to you can feel dangerous because it reveals where you are emotionally invested. It gives another person information about what could hurt you. So when an avoidant begins acknowledging your importance publicly or privately, that can represent another layer of trust. They are no longer keeping the connection completely hidden behind emotional distance. And this is why you have to learn to recognize the language of quiet affection. With a guarded person, love may not arrive through dramatic speeches or constant reassurance. Sometimes it appears through staying when leaving would be easier, communicating when silence would feel safer, showing up when you need support, reaching out without being prompted, returning after conflict, imagining a future with you, and protecting the connection when other people challenge it. None of these behaviors should be used as proof that someone loves you without considering the entire relationship. Healthy love still requires consistency, respect, accountability, and mutual effort. But when those qualities appear together over time, they can reveal something important. The person who once protected themselves from closeness may be learning that closeness with you does not have to mean losing themselves. And sometimes that quiet change is far more powerful than any grand romantic gesture. When an avoidant openly stands beside you, especially where other people can see it, that can carry more weight than you realize. Guarded people often protect what matters to them because revealing what they value can make them feel exposed. If someone knows exactly what you care about, they also know where you can be hurt. So when an avoidant makes it clear that you matter to them, defends you when someone speaks unfairly about you, or allows other people to see the importance of your relationship, they are taking an emotional risk. They are essentially saying, "This person matters to me, and I am willing to let people know it." That requires trust, not only in you, but in the relationship itself. But perhaps one of the deepest signs comes when they allow you to see them struggling. Not the capable version they normally present. Not the person who always seems composed, independent, and completely in control. I mean the version who genuinely does not know what to do, the person who has had a terrible day, the person who feels lost, uncertain, exhausted, or simply unable to pretend that everything is fine. Maybe they tell you, "I don't know how to handle this." Maybe they admit, "I'm not doing okay." Or perhaps they become visibly sad, and instead of immediately hiding it, they allow you to remain there while they experience it. For someone who has built their identity around self-reliance, this can feel incredibly exposing. Their independence is often more than a personality trait. It can become emotional armor. Being capable, needing little, and handling everything alone may have once helped them feel protected from disappointment and rejection. So when that armor drops, even briefly, you are seeing something much more authentic. Sometimes they deliberately show you that vulnerable side. Other times it happens without planning. They simply feel safe enough around you that the defenses loosen before they can put them back into place. And that can be significant. But there is something important you need to understand. Recognizing these patterns does not mean you should excuse every unhealthy behavior. You do not have to accept repeated disappearing, emotional neglect, coldness, or being treated poorly simply because someone has an avoidant attachment pattern. Understanding the reason behind a behavior is not the same as approving the behavior. You can have compassion without abandoning your standards. The real question is whether the person is making progress. Are they learning to communicate? Are they becoming more present? Do they return after withdrawing? Are they taking responsibility? Are they making an effort to build something healthier with you? There is a major difference between someone who refuses to engage emotionally and someone who is genuinely struggling but slowly learning how to connect. That distinction matters. When someone pulls back after becoming close, it may sometimes be fear rather than a lack of feeling. When they become quiet after an emotionally intense experience, they may be overwhelmed rather than indifferent. When intimacy suddenly becomes frightening and they create distance, it may be because the connection has become more emotionally powerful than they know how to manage. But again, none of that means you should tolerate anything that repeatedly hurts you. You should never have to become smaller just to make another person's fears easier to manage. Instead, look at the pattern. There are people who have walked away from relationships without realizing that the person they loved was actually trying. They may have seen the withdrawal but missed the return. They noticed the silence but overlooked the moments of initiation. They felt the distance but failed to recognize the small ways that person was remembering them, showing up, communicating, and slowly allowing their defenses to come down. Maybe they wanted something more obvious. Maybe they believed love had to be loud to be real. And perhaps they were right to want more consistency. But sometimes they also failed to recognize the language the other person was using. Now you know what to look for. Ask yourself whether there is someone in your life who has quietly been making these efforts. Has someone stayed when leaving would have been easier? Have they shown up for you during difficult moments? Have they remembered details you thought they had forgotten? Have they reached out first? Have they returned after conflict? Have they started including you in future plans? Have they allowed you to see parts of them that they normally hide? If the answer is yes, then perhaps you are seeing a form of emotional communication you did not previously know how to interpret. And that gives you a choice. You can recognize the effort instead of waiting only for dramatic proof. You can meet vulnerability with patience without abandoning your own needs. You can stop measuring every expression of love against the loudest version of romance and start noticing the quieter forms of courage. Because people often express love through the emotional tools they were taught. Some people were given a rich vocabulary for affection. Others learned only a few words, yet they may still be trying to use every one of them. That does not mean you should settle for the bare minimum. It means you can learn to distinguish between a person who is unwilling to love well and a person who is slowly learning how. Perhaps you have been carrying a question about someone for a long time. Do they really care? Is what I'm experiencing genuine? Why do they act so differently from what I expected? Why can they be so close one moment and so guarded the next? Maybe the answer is not as simple as they do not care. Sometimes the person who struggles most with closeness is also the person who has the most fear surrounding what closeness means. The rarest form of love from a deeply guarded person may not be a grand declaration. It may be the repeated decision to move toward you despite the fear telling them to move away. It may happen through a text they almost did not send, a conversation they almost avoided, an apology they did not want to make, a future plan they were afraid to imagine, or a moment when their defenses slipped and they allowed you to see the real person underneath. Those moments can be easy to overlook because they are ordinary on the outside, but sometimes ordinary moments contain extraordinary courage. Still, never confuse silence with communication or inconsistency with love. Pay attention to what they actually do over time. Healthy love eventually needs action, accountability, respect, and mutual effort. If someone is genuinely reaching toward you, let their actions speak, but make sure those actions are becoming more consistent, not simply keeping you trapped in a cycle of hope and confusion. And if you have ever loved someone quiet, guarded, or difficult to understand, perhaps the greatest lesson is this: not every person expresses affection in a language you immediately recognize. Sometimes the person who seems hardest to read is carrying feelings they have spent years learning to hide. So stay observant, stay grounded, keep your standards, but do not automatically dismiss the quiet moments, because sometimes the smallest movement toward connection is the clearest evidence that something inside that person is changing. And when someone who once believed closeness was dangerous begins reaching toward you anyway, that courage is worth recognizing. Love from an avoidant may not arrive with grand declarations. It may appear in the quiet moments when they choose connection, despite everything inside them telling them to run. Their courage can live in the message they send, the conversation they return to, the future they begin imagining, and the walls they finally allow you to see beyond. Never lower your standards, but learn to recognize genuine effort when it is there. Because sometimes the rarest expression of love is simply choosing you, again and again, even while learning how to overcome the fear of being close.